Good morning, everyone. I want to make sure that everyone has had a chance to join. I see the participants number continuing to rise, which fills my heart. I'm happy to know we have so many people here to listen and engage on such an important topic. I'm buying some time while we're watching people pop in, but if you are here for the Community Plus Values Martin Luther King Jr. Day panel, then you are in the right place. And my name is Ann Ayers. I have the honor of being one of the folks who leads the Community Plus Values initiative across the DU community. And it is my honor to be here today. I feel brave and blessed to be here on this topic. I want to tell you just briefly about Community Plus Values. It's an initiative that was started a little over 2 years ago across this campus in recognition of a need to really be more inclusive, to create a sense of belonging and opportunity for belonging for everyone on this campus. And it has been an absolute joy to meet so many people through this work, and to have people like the panelists who we have today here who just kind of carry this mission forward for us. So I want to say thank you to all of the panelists. I will not be doing the introducing. I'm just going to introduce our facilitator. But I also, as we get going, want to say a thank you to the C+V team behind the scenes. So I want to say thanks to Chase McNamee, who is our senior project lead on all of these, to Matt and Dill and Lanaya, who are our graduate fellows. You all are phenomenal and amazing. Weston, thank you on the IT side. I really appreciate everything that your team does to make all of this possible. And we do have closed captioning available, which means that we have a captioner here. And I don't know the name of that person today. It changes from time to time, but thank you so much for being here and making this even further accessible to folks who need to use that captioning. If you are one of those people, then you should have an option in the bottom of your Zoom screen that says closed caption. You click on the up arrow that's there, and then you should be able to activate that. So welcome. This is going to be a panel conversation on the Black liberation movement. We entitled it Letters from a Birmingham Jail to Black Lives Matter. And in addition to my work on C+V, I have, in the last 2 years really, been working across campus with another extraordinary group of people. There's many of us at DU who fall into that extraordinary category, and who care deeply about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We launched at the Colorado Women's College, and now in partnership with the Graduate School for Social Work, we launched something called Equity Labs. And we're all in this journey together. One of the pieces of my journey, in particular as a white cisgender woman, is to really learn about listening and listening to learn. And so wherever this panel finds you today in your own learning journeys, I think it's our great hope at C+V that it continues to move you along that journey, and that you feel filled up by this, because I think we all feel so drained by a lot that's going on now. So with that, and keeping in mind that I want to be in a place of real listening here, I want to introduce you to our facilitator. Chandu, are you going to turn on your camera?
I sure am.
So Chandu is going to be leading us this afternoon, or this morning, and I just am going to hand it over to you. I think it's going to
perfect.
And
perfect.
And our other panelists to also be coming off of your, turning on your cameras and coming off of mute as he's introducing you and getting us going.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you so much, Anne, and the C+V team. I want to welcome all of you virtually to the University of Denver, which resides on the ancestral home of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute tribes. It is an absolute honor for me to facilitate this, powerhouse team of intellectuals and practitioners on a conversation about Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and the Black liberation movement. It's a timely conversation, not just because we are approaching Martin Luther King Day, but also given the kind of geopolitics of our land. currently. So let me quickly introduce our panelists. We have Harold Franklin, an alum of DU's Corbell School, and an educator of for a long time with a stellar reputation. We have Dr. Art Jones, a former vice chancellor of diversity, equity, and inclusion at the University of Denver. We have Dr. Jason Jeffries, a professor here who specializes in Black liberation theology. And we have Bwesa Itaji, who is a recent graduate and a community organizer who advocates for urban agriculture and food justice. So it really is a panel that kind of spans disciplines and generations. And that is the beauty of it, right? Because the Black liberation movement also spans generations, disciplines, geographies. So I'd love to start off by just giving a chance for our panelists to do some storytelling, right? This is a long kind of struggle, and we all come into it in different ways, in different disciplines, in different lenses. So I'd love to hear how you entered this kind of this world of Black liberation work. So let's start with Harold. Can you tell us a little bit about how you entered this space? Okay, sounds good. We're going to go to someone else and we'll come back to Harold in a minute. Dr. Jones, can you tell us how you entered this space?
Yes, so for me, I think it was fits and starts at first before I kind of jumped in full speed. You know, I grew up in the Bronx in New York, and my parents had come to New York from the South, and they were very aspirational in terms of all of us, their children, in terms of wanting us to get ahead and everything. And part of what we learned from them was this sort of narrative that if we worked really hard and we did everything that we needed to do, we could ignore racism and everything would work out okay. And I was sort of working off that narrative through college. During college, I had some experiences, or actually right before college, I went and got some training in nonviolence resistance in Alabama, but it wasn't really center for me. It was sort of like I was gonna get my degree and get ahead and be successful, whatever. And it wasn't really until I had some time in the military in the early 70s during the Vietnam War, where I really saw racism sort of, you know, more fully. And it was at that point that when I went back to graduate school and in my training as a clinical psychologist, that I decided that the way I was going to make change was through my work as a psychologist and scholar. And then I was full bore. I think from that point on, that's what I've done for the rest of my, you know, in addition to being involved in the community and other things, but my main contribution has been through my work as a psychologist and as a scholar.
Perfect, thank you. We have Harold's mic back on. Harold, can you tell us how you kind of came into the work of, you know, educating Black youth and kind of liberating their mind and soul and spirit? Like, what brought you into that work?
Well, I had graduated from Alabama State College in Montgomery, and to make a long story short, they were trying to find someone to desegregate Auburn University. And my ambition was to become an attorney at law. So I was talking, and in the state of Alabama, you had to have 5 lawyers who've been practicing in the state for 5 years to verify your character prior to admittance. So I was in Montgomery at the time with Dr. King and all the other civil rights people. And so I talked to Attorney Fred Gray, who was Dr. King's attorney, as one of the attorneys that I want to recommend me. And we talked, and so he said, Harold, why don't you go to Auburn? he looked at my LSAT scores, and he said, I don't think your scores are high enough to challenge, because I want to stay here in Alabama. This is my home. And the only state law school was at the University of Alabama, so I felt as an Alabamian, I had a right to attend a state institution where I lived. And so I don't think your scores are high enough. Anyway, we made a long story short, we talked. He said, why don't you go to graduate school and you know, to hopefully help yourself to get your scores up high enough to challenge Alabama. And when we talked about it, he said, what school, you know, what school? And I said, I don't know. He said, what about Auburn University? And I really didn't want to go to Auburn University because Auburn, when I was growing up, was known as an agricultural school. Mm. And I really didn't like, when Dad was growing garden, I didn't even want to work in the little garden we had. And so anyway, I talked to my wife about it. She says, well, if you want to go, you go. And so I talked to Attorney Fred Gray, who was Dr. King's attorney, as I said. And to make a long story short, I applied to Auburn University for a master's degree in history and government, political science, all that, social science. And they turned me down, of course, to make a long story short. And so we decided to go to court. And so we went to federal court, and Attorney Gray handled my case for me. And Auburn said, to make a long story short, Auburn said they didn't turn me down because I was Black. They turned me down because Alabama State College wasn't accredited. But the state superintendent of education is white, Austin R. Meadows, testified that the reason that the two Black state-supported institutions were not accredited was because the legislature of Alabama would not adequately fund those schools as they were doing for the white schools, because all the white schools were accredited. And I'll never forget, as long as I live, Judge Johnson, who was a federal judge there in Montgomery at the time, to make a long story short, ruled in my favor. And on January the 4th, then I turned around and asked Auburn for living accommodations. They turned me down again. And so we went back into federal court. And Auburn said the reason they turned me down for living accommodation was because graduate students, most of them did not live on campus. And I'll never forget Judge Johnson say, where do they live? And he said, you know, people have rooms and apartments, et cetera, that they advertise through the university for students. And Judge Johnson asked Auburn University, said, well, how do you all know about this list? They said, well, they notified the university that these you know, living accommodations are available. And they said, okay, did y'all notify Mr. Franklin that these places were available? And I'll never forget the guy, I can't remember his name, but anyway, he said, they were white. He called himself. And my lawyer, we just won our second case against Auburn. And sure enough, Judge Johnson ruled in our favor again. So they went and they put me in a dormitory, the whole wing of a dormitory. I think it's 3 stories tall by myself. The only way you get in the wing of that dormitory, I had to let you in the front door. And so January the 4th, 1964 was the day I registered for classes. And so I got there, and like I said, I ended up in a whole wing of a dormitory by myself. And then eventually, I think that was on a Friday or Saturday. And the following Monday, I entered classes and registration. And I requested the classes I wanted to take in history. And we had some disagreement over that. And so anyway, to make a long story short, I ended up taking the courses I wanted to take. And they did treated me like I was an African American. Back then, he treated me like I was one of the white kids, of course, about it. And one of the things that angered me more than anything else was that the term for African American, the term was Negro. And I never had a single teacher at Auburn University ever pronounced the word Negro. It was the Negro this, the Negro that, when they talk about something in the Black experience or some Black history. And I got kind of angry, and I went back to my attorney because I was about to curse the guys out. And he told me, he said, look, be cool. He said, we need you to stay there until we can get some more African Americans to come, and I did. But I was angry. I'm not going to tell you a lie about it because, I said, if I can say Caucasian, I know they can say African American or Black, or Negro. And, but anyway, I stayed there and had to listen to a lot of that kind of crap. And did pretty good in my classes. I had some problems, of course, being an African American, first African American there, with some of the teachers. But I finished my academics, and then we got to my thesis. And I wanted to write my thesis on some aspect of the civil rights struggle. And they told me it was too controversial. I go back on the history of Alabama State College, the school I had graduated from. And it really didn't interest me. Some reason, don't ask me why, but I didn't. But I'm interested in the civil rights struggle. And so many fascinating people were, involved in it that I wanted to talk about them and the contributions they were making to society. And Auburn would not accept it. So to make a long story short, I went in and researched the history of Alabama State College. And each time I would carry back for proofreading, they found an excuse to not accept it. And I got a little over angry one day, and I told my major professor, I said, excuse me, Brent, I said, hell, what you're telling me is I won't get a degree from Auburn. So I said, forget it. Because I had been to the thesis room and I had read some kids' thesis. And excuse me, French, but some of them, I wouldn't even let a high school kid get by with it. And yet these were graduate students. And that's what got me angry with them. And nevertheless, like I said, I withdrew. And in the meantime, I started teaching at Tuskegee University, Alabama State College, ended up Talladega College. In the meantime, sometime later, I ended up winning a scholarship to the University of Denver. And my famous classmate was Condoleezza Rice. And they're originally from Alabama too. So I ended up with my master's degree in international studies. I did my residential requirement for my doctorate, but I didn't finish my doctorate. And I ended up teaching, like I said, at Talladega College, Alabama State, and a couple of them while at the University of Denver. I taught Black history, African American history, and that became my love. I learned something from the thing I learned in Black history, and so I stayed, like I said, I stayed there, and I retired from Talladega College. At Auburn, family conferred on me my master's degree. I did it this year, last year. After all these years, they finally gave me my master's degree. And then they turned around and gave me an honorary doctorate degree.
Thank you so much for fighting those battles for us, because I think all of us.
In the 60s, that's what we were to do. We had to fight racism. And I happen to be one of the persons that could contribute something to eradicating racism. And like I said, I didn't want to go to Auburn University. That was the last school in the world I ever wanted to go. They never appealed to me. I wanted to go, like I said, to law school. And Auburn did not have a law school. Alabama had one. University of Alabama had a law school. But one of the reasons that I think my attorney got me to go to Auburn. I didn't go because the federal judge, as I told you, Frank Johnson, was a very liberal when it came to racism, and without a question. But he ruled in my favor. And I knew that then, he just didn't believe in racism. And as a result of it, on January 4th, like I said, 1964, I walked onto campus after that and struggled for a living accommodation.
Yeah, let me get some of our other speakers in. Dr. Jeffries, how did you enter this work? Oh, you're muted, sir.
All right, thank you.
Uh-oh, did he freeze?
I would say has always been through. In a way, well, hello, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead. Your image is frozen, but we can hear you.
Okay. My pathway has been through religion. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri, and attended a progressive Baptist church where the pastor was also the president of the Board of Education. And so he followed a sort of minister/politician model. I later found out that my pastor also attended Morehouse College with Dr. Martin King Jr. And so there was always a sense of a pride in education, a sense of social activity, so on and so forth. I went to undergraduate school at Prairie View A&M University, where there was a professor named Omari Obadeli, who was at the time one of the founders of the Republic of New Africa, which is an organization that fought for reparations in the late 70s, early 80s, and was associated with the Malcolm X Society after he split from the Nation of Islam. And so I became aware of reparations and things of that nature at my university, Prairie View A&M University. After that, I went on to work in Dallas, and I joined a church that was basically a Black liberation / social gospel type church. And it was pretty liberal in Dallas, Texas. And also they would bring in academics and other pastors who were concerned about Black theology and social justice. And so a lot of the ministries were not formed around sort of like social clubs, but they were formed around sort of social and political activism within the church. A turning point came for me when I started to feel a call to ministry, and Pastor Jeremiah Wright, who many will know as President Barack Obama's former pastor, came to the church and did a lecture, not a sermon, a lecture, and he lectured on the Christian church's connection to Africa. And he started talking about the biblical scripture through Ethiopia and making an argument that the people of the Bible were Black. And after that lecture, I felt like I didn't know enough to do the work that I wanted to do. And so I went to seminary at Virginia Union University with the plans to engage in Christian ministry and so on. So I went to a conference while at Virginia Union. It was an ecumenical conference for Black churches in New Orleans, Louisiana. It was 2 years after Hurricane Katrina had devastated and ravaged the city. And 2 years later, when I arrived, I saw a village of people literally living under the Interstate 10 overpass on the main street that enters, I believe it's Canal Street, that enters the French Quarter. And during that time at the conference, we were supposed to do something to help the people under the overpass who were literally living there under the overpass. And we organized the march and went there, and the solution in my opinion, was ineffective. In fact, it struck me. I couldn't speak. I couldn't think about anything except for we were doing an ineffective job at helping the people in need. And we were supposed to be doing that as a church, right? And so that led me to question whether or not the church was the proper place to do the work of social justice, right? Which led me on an academic journey that got me where I am today at DU, teaching classes like Black liberation theology, so on and so forth.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that. And certainly, our paths, came from different places, but it sounds like we all ended up in similar places. Bueza, what brought you to this work? Can you give us a little insight on your journey?
Yes, and first I'd like to say I feel so honored and humbled to be on this panel amongst some incredible people who really blazed the trail for me. So I'm so grateful to all of you for all of the work that you've done. I would say for me, I was almost born into Black liberation. My father immigrated to the US from Uganda. My mother grew up in one of the worst housing projects in Chicago, Cabrini Green. And they both had a deep commitment and passion to furthering our people and really deconstructing and decolonizing our minds. And that was instilled in me at a very early age. And of course, I went through phases of wanting to assimilate more, wanting to just coast and not be engaged in that fight for liberation. But it quickly became clear to me that that was my duty and my obligation in honor to and respect to all of the people who had come before me, who had risked their lives and their safety in order to propel our people, propel Black people within America and globally. So I now am in Chicago and have seen the way that many of our health and wellness as Black people is tied to the environment and the food that we eat, as well as the spaces in which we live. And I see the ways that historically the cycle perpetuates us asking for resources, asking for food, petitioning for grocery stores to be put in neighborhoods that are usually and often white-owned grocery stores. And I have connected with a beautiful community of folks in Chicago who are trying to truly liberate ourselves by having that liberation come from within us. So I am part of a group of urban farmers who are hard at work to grow food, to nourish our communities, to talk about the importance of knowing where our food comes from, while also acknowledging all of the harm and trauma that exists within agriculture as Black people in America. We have all of that is passed down generationally from the effects of being enslaved for hundreds of years. So I'm working with a wonderful collective of people to empower ourselves by reclaiming our ability to grow food and to connect with the land in order to ideally truly liberate us.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that, because really, I think one of the common threads of the Black experience is that idea of trauma that comes from all different kinds of sources. So let's, if we can talk a little bit about that, when we look at kind of the arc of the Black liberation movement, the common narrative is that the Black liberation movement is kind of segmented, right? Like the first kind of slaves, the first people who were enslaved in the continent of Africa, then the Underground Railroad, and then the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, and now Black Lives Movement. But I think it's worth questioning, is that really that segmented, or has it always been this kind of arc that's continued, morphed into different kind of arenas, but it's still the same movement, right? Like the first resistance of the Black people began when the first Africans were enslaved, and we're still fighting the same fights, right? It's just in different arenas. So I'm wondering if y'all can speak to what are some of those common threads that tie that entire Black liberation movement across the generations and geographies. What are some of those threads that you can recognize?
Yeah, you know, I can jump in with this. Is something that I've thought about a lot. I think one of the mistakes that we often make is we look at what's going on in terms of the outer manifestations of things that are happening, as opposed to what the underlying dynamics are. And I think the one way that I found is really helpful to reconceptualize this is that the underlying dynamic has to do with the myth of Black inferiority, Black violence, all of that stuff. And, you know, centuries ago, there were folks that exploited that myth to create the systems, various systems of oppression. Those systems changed over time as progress was made. You know, it's almost like they improvised new ways of basically kind of really working in that same underlying narrative. But the main thing was really this idea that you could create a hierarchy and Black people would be at the bottom, and anyone who's above that would feel some kind of entitlement, some kind of privilege, or whatever. And it's changed over time, you know, whether it was slavery or whether it was lynching or whether it was segregation, or what we're dealing with now a lot is all the stuff in the criminal justice system. But the underlying thing has always been the same. Yeah, I'm just aware now as I'm reaching the age that I am now, that in my time of coming into, you know, being as a person, as an adult, segregation was the dominant thing that everybody thought about. And the segregation happened in the South in a very formal way. You might want to call it dominative racism. In the North, it happened in sort of a more veiled way. We might call it de facto segregation, but the idea was that if you keep the races apart, the white people could be somehow spared from the injuries that would be created by Black people, you know, because we were so violent, and also because we were so inferior in terms of our intelligence. We had nothing to contribute. I was aware when I was a kid in the South Bronx of how de facto segregation really worked. I remember our family lived a block from one of the from the railroad lines that went from Westchester County down into New York City, through the Bronx and into Manhattan. And a lot of us, like when I was 8 or 9 years old, my friends and I would just sort of stand there and watch the trains go by. It was so interesting that all these white people riding on these computer lines would never, ever look out to see us. They were buried in their papers or whatever. It was like we were invisible. We didn't exist. And that was kind of the manifestation of it then. But anyway, I think it's the underlying dynamic that's the same. And when the dominant kind of form of racism, you know, appears, there's a fight that's focused on that. But that doesn't mean the movement is different. It just means we're having to deal with whatever's in front of us right now. You know, killing of unarmed Black people right now, and the mass incarceration. Those are things that are in front of us right now. So we're focused on those, but it's the same struggle. It's the same movement.
Yeah. And you know, this idea of Black inferiority, that really is the underlying kind of tenet of this disparity that we've created. Somehow it seems to find life in a morality argument, right? And Dr. King was very intentional about breaking down that morality argument. His argument was that, you know, there's something fundamentally and morally wrong about creating this hierarchy, Does that argument work? Because we've been making that argument for a long time. Are we missing something? Jason, I wonder what your thoughts are on this.
I think you have to go back and think about what Dr. Jones said, that there's this myth of inferiority, like sort of embedded in American culture for Black bodies. But you also have to think about, sort of the Constitution, at least how it was written, and also who it included, right? And so this morally, it being morally wrong to sort of have oppression and things like that accounts for human beings, right? And so if you look at the Constitution and the way that Blacks were treated in the foundations of America, we were not considered human beings. And so therefore we could not have morality, right? And so King's argument works if everyone is considered the same being, the same essence, so on and so forth, right? And so these myths of violence and inferiority, hypersexuality that Dr. Jones is mentioning still play a large factor, because a lot of the fear I think we see in today's society is sort of fear of Black people still being hyper violent, hypersexual, hyper and unintelligent, so on and so forth. And I think it's almost regardless of how many Black people have success or reach the highest levels. We had a president, for example, African-American president, and there were literally newspaper articles comparing him to Curious George. There were comments about his articulation. He's articulate, parentheses, for a Black man. You understand what I'm saying? And so those stereotypes still exist regardless of what level of achievement or success that African Americans reach. And so that's a difficult question. I think it's true. Morality question is an adequate question, but I like to focus on sort of these structural and legal methods. Also, piggying back off of Dr. Jones, I think that the Black struggle has always been a struggle of space, right? So for example, in slavery, African Americans are confined to certain places. They can't go anywhere without permission. If you look at Reconstruction, you see all these vagrancy laws and laws against intermarrying. Black people are subjected to particular types of jobs, service jobs in the service of white people, white wealth and leisure. You go on to Brown versus the Board of Education. Black people are restricted from being in certain places with white people. And when they violate that, the punishment is often physical violence or death. And it's supported by the non-prosecution of people available. The lynch mobs were there, and often police and sheriffs were there present as part of the lynch mob. And so the problems I think that are happening today with the deaths of Black people at the hands of law enforcement is not new. I think that it is an age-old American problem, and we still have a long way to go in terms of that. Part of the problem for me as well is sort of this attitude of not acknowledging the reality and the impact of slavery, Jim and Jane Crow, separate but equal, so on and so forth, in America writ large. And it's not just sort of conversations that happen in the polis, but that attitude is sort of reinforced through elementary school systems and the middle school systems, right? With states deciding to take slavery out of the history curriculum, so on and so forth, right?
Yeah. Let's
consider Black history something separate from American history.
Yeah.
When in fact they're intertwined.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to explore this idea of, racism as a manifestation of restricting Black people from space. And certainly, I think one of those spaces that Black people have been restricted from is the idea of kind of agriculture and kind of separating them from their connection to the earth. What are some, or how do some of those thinking still manifest in the work that you're doing, Weza? Do you see that in our communities? And what are you doing to contest that or break that kind of thinking?
Absolutely. I see in Chicago as an example. First, I'll say Chicago is still an extremely segregated city. It's very blatant and undeniable. The most Black people are confined to the south side of the city, which is the majority of the actual landmass of Chicago, but it also has the least amount of resources and the least amount of support from the city. So in a lot of those neighborhoods, there are mass amounts of vacant land that is sitting unused, that is typically owned by outside development companies that are just waiting for the property values to increase for them to be able to profit off of this space. And at the same time, within our neighborhoods, there is a lack of access to fresh food, a lack of access to quality and affordable housing, yet there's no shortage of land. And that juxtaposition is alarming and is very intentional. So in my work and in trying to inspire and encourage our community to have agency over our environment and to be able to work with the land and cultivate the land, a lot of that is undoing some of the negative associations that a lot of Black people have with agriculture. As I mentioned, it is impossible to talk about growing food as Black people in America without acknowledging the long history of us being exploited and extracted and murdered in order to grow food for this country. So much of what I do is in trying to shift that narrative and framing it more as a return to the land, because we as Black people, as Indigenous people, have always had a healthy connection to the land, have always had mutual respect for the land. And now in this time, it's so crucial for us to have ownership of the land. I prefer to frame it as stewardship, because I don't know that land should be owned in the way that we view it in this country. But it's a long process of just trying to show land as power and trying to encourage us to grow our own food, to not have to be subject to all of that harm that comes with land access.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you. And another space that I think Black bodies have been restricted from is certainly education, evidenced by Harold's struggles. Harold, in your case, you kind of went to the law to find a remedy, right? And in some ways it worked, even though it was justice delayed. Is that where we seek our remedy? Because certainly Dr. King argued that, you can't necessarily, laws and constitutions have to be the necessary backstop for when the morality argument doesn't work. That's how we protect ourselves. So Harold, what are your thoughts? Is the legal course one of the viable ways for us to find that remedy?
I think that what we have to do is to look at what each other need, and then whatever is necessary to challenge this racism or whatever it is, you do it. And one of the things I liked about it was Dr. King. If you look at it, he's saying basically with the Montgomery bus boycott, for example. Now, all the years that Dr. King did not live in Alabama, we had segregation and the bus and everywhere else. But here's a man, here's a stranger to us, who comes in and teaches us that there is a such thing as right or wrong, and right and wrong. And he initiated the beginning of, to me, the civil rights struggle in Alabama. Because with the bus boycott, what the city of Montgomery found out was they were losing money. And remember, a lot of things about white people is what? Money. And with that money talking BS walk, that's the thing. And even though they did not want to change the law from segregation to desegregation, I don't call it integration, to desegregation, they would not do it, even though they were losing money, until the court stepped in. When the court stepped in and ruled in our favor, then of course, the law changes. And not only the bus boycott, but other segments of racism also began to break down. And then eventually, you know, with the Voter Rights Act, the Civil Rights Act, and other pieces of legislation by Congress, that also helped us to overcome some of the racism that we had struggled with for years. Mm-hmm. And of course, there were some people in the South, also whites in the South, who were supporting us to a certain degree. And they also contributed to, because during the bus boycott, for example, I was in school at Alabama State College, the Alabama State College in those days at Montgomery. And I got a chance to see some of the people who were making contributions to and for us who were white. Of course, they did not want it to be known who they were, you know, what they were doing, because they didn't want to be ostracized or possibly lynched, to put it bluntly. But they contributed immensely to the bus boycott and other activities that sort of put us as a first-class citizen. And you can see that by looking at the passage of the Voter Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act. There were a number of people, whites, who did not want to be known. They were supporting these acts, but they did. And some of them suffered as a result of, like we had suffered. But they did pass the legislation. So we overcame things, odds to them, and really to them, because they are majority in the House and the Senate of the United States. And as a result of it, you see, we benefited to some degree. We're not still sometimes in some instances treated as first-class citizens, right. But things are a little better to a certain degree than they were before our parents passed away, right. And all that. And before some of us got a chance to benefit. So it's my belief that the civil rights struggle is one of the most important aspects of not African American, but American history. Yes. Because not only did it change in Montgomery, Birmingham, but all through the United States. Mississippi, Georgia, you name it. It became a part of us and those who supported us. And I'll be honest about that, there were a number of whites who supported us too, to help us overcome racism and to be treated as first-class citizens. And you can see that also by looking at Congress when it passed the Voter Rights Act, 65, the Civil Rights Act of 64. Yeah. There were some Southern Congress people who supported it. There were some legislators who encouraged them to do what was right. And as a result of it, we had benefited to a certain degree from these actions sponsored by state legislatures and the federal government.
Yeah. Thank you. So how do you, because certainly there's the morality argument, and Harold suggests this idea that we all benefit when we kind of contest racism and sexism and just kind of every other identity-based ism that we have. How do you kind of make that case for communities or populations who have a vested interest in sustaining the current standing, right? Like there are communities that benefit from racism, but the argument is, if we can overcome racism, if that is ever a thing, right? Critical race theorists would say that's never going to happen. But if we contest racism, everybody benefits. How do you sell that argument to communities who have a vested interest in keeping status quo?
Yep. Can I jump in here?
Yeah, please.
About that? So I think this is a very interesting kind of thing. People try to create these dichotomies, is it a moral argument or is it, a structural
pragmatic
argument? Yeah, I think the structural things are really important because they have to do with our safety and our existence. And we have to, if people are killing us, we have to, stop them from killing us and so forth. But eventually, I think when we talk about morality, I think people think about it in a really superficial way. King's main mentor was Howard Thurman, who was a mystic and theologian who really, what he talked about and what he practiced in his work is as a pastor or whatever, was the idea that if you try to talk about what's right and what's wrong, it doesn't go very far. People don't get much out of that. So like, why would you do something that's right if it makes you miserable, right? What he talked about is the fact that when people get a chance to experience the fact that they've been duped into thinking that their self-esteem is connected to their possessions, to their power, to their status, it's going to be very difficult for them to change their behavior. But if you allow them the experience of understanding that they can feel whole and powerful just because they can connect to a deeper part of themselves, it's really a spiritual, psychological experience, then everybody's motivated to make the change because that's so much more satisfying. I had a teacher once who told me, he said, she said, Arthur, you need to know as you move up in the world or whatever, that when you have enough, it's always enough. But when you have more than enough, it's never enough. So, you see these millionaires who are feeling like they have to have more money. They're threatened by Black people because their portfolios are going to shrink from 4 million to 2 million. And they really have this idea that somehow their self-esteem is tied up in that. So Howard Thurman he was the first person to start a church that was a truly multicultural church in San Francisco. And people came from all walks of life to that church. And it was a really popular place. People loved going there. And so he was able to erase all of these barriers that people had. So I think ultimately, we got to deal with all these structures, but ultimately we have to find ways that people can experience these deeper parts of themselves. It's a tough thing to do, but I've had some really great experience with mentors who have done that work. People like, Vincent Harding, who was one of the people who really influenced King a lot, wrote the speech that King gave opposing the Vietnam War. Those are the experience. Those are ultimately the ways that the deeper change is going to happen. And it's tough, but I think I tried to do that in my classes. I try to create environments where people from different backgrounds can really get to know each other and understand and have that experience of that deeper part of themselves that motivate them to make the changes.
Absolutely. We are almost at time. So I just want to kind of say thank you, my profound gratitude to all of you for having this really important conversation. I think certainly, as Dr. Jones suggested, Dr. Martin Luther King's ultimate goal was just the recognition of every individual's humanity. That has immense power, and that is our pathway to creating a more just and equitable world. So I just want to take this moment to kind of let us all kind of reflect on that idea of recognizing and celebrating each other's humanity. And I want to thank you all so much for having this really important conversation with us. So with that, I'm going to pass it back to Anne to close out our session. Thank you so much.
Thank all of you so much for bringing, gosh, your lived experience and your learned experiences to all of us today. And Art, Dr. Jones, I agree. And if you all have a minute to pop into the Q&A, Sister Fred, who I think is known in our community to many of us, has a sentiment there that I really share, which is I hope that all of us can go forward and create experiences where people can really feel whole and powerful. This has been one of those moments for me. I have really appreciated turning off my camera and just listening. And I'm going to try to do that in my teams. I think we really need to do that for each other at DU and for ourselves and in the world. So I think people on this call in particular, I want to say thank you, because the work that you're doing is the work that our world really, really needs right now. And I know it's really hard to do that work. And so I'm just really, obviously, a little overwhelmed and so super grateful for all of you and many of the people, again, behind the scenes. I want to also mention Brianna Taylor, who puts together Heritage Months out of our Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and that whole team, which, you know, as I've gotten to know them over the last 3 years, I've really been grateful for their work too. So if anybody has any follow-up, please follow up with, you're welcome to follow up with me directly, follow up with the C+V website, follow up, I think, with any of our panelists too. I think I see some nodding. I think that there's a lot of wisdom to be mined and deep hearts there too. So thank you all. Take care of yourselves and take care of each other. We have a lot going on in this world, and next week will be a big week. So my very best to everybody, and thank you all again.